Motivation is an important thing in life. When we're motivated, we become empowered to do things even when they're difficult or challenging. When we lack motivation, even the simplest of tasks can become a mountain to climb. We can be motivated by all kinds of things, of course. Some are good and some are bad. In today's reading in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 13 to 16, Paul will explain the greatest motivating factor that there was in his life. For whether we be beside ourselves, it is to God, or whether we be sober, it is for your cause. The love of Christ constraineth us, because we thus judge that if one died for all, then we're all dead, and that he died for all, that they which live should not henceforth live unto themselves, but unto him which died for them and rose again. Wherefore, henceforth know we no man after the flesh, yea, though we have known Christ after the flesh, yet now henceforth know we him no more. Have you ever been part of a huge crowd, maybe a crowd of several thousand people, that slowly exited a building? When the Belfast Easter Conference was held in the Grosvenor Hall over 40 years ago, I recall how after the final meeting it took so long to get out of the building. And why was that? Well, quite simply, the progress of the huge mass of people was limited by the size of the exits. It was constrained by being forced to move through a particular space, a particular restricted space. Paul tells us in today's reading that the love of Christ constraineth us in verse 14. The love of Christ moved him in a particular direction. That particular direction was devoted service to God, and it was shown by a genuine service and care for the spiritual advancement and advantage of the Corinthians. If people thought of him as mad for doing so, whether we be beside ourselves, he says in verse 13, he reminds them that he acted simply that God might be glorified. It is to God also, verse 13. If his behaviour was right and proper, as it was, whether we be sober, verse 13, it was for their benefit. It is for your cause. Paul was not driven by love of himself or love of his apostolic status, but by a far greater love. It was the love of Christ, verse 14. So what is meant by the love of Christ? Is it Paul's love for Christ, or is it Christ's love for Paul? I think that we have the answer to that in Paul's own words, the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me, in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. Paul in his service was compelled by the tremendous love of Christ for him, and it was by acting in keeping with the sacrificial love that Christ displayed, even to death, that Paul was able to be selfless in his own service. And when he says the love of Christ constraineth us in verse 14, he means that it left him with no other option. It drove him to this course of action, like the people going out through the exits of the Easter Conference, or as a funnel directs all that enters it at the wide end through the narrow end. Paul got to grips with the implications of the love of Christ and the death of Christ in a way that I do not think that I have. So what are those implications? Paul explains them this way. If one died for all, then we're all dead, in verse 14 as well. Because Christ died for all, everyone who is linked to Christ is dead with him. Dead to their own interests and ambitions, alive in Christ and alive for Christ. And so he goes on to write, they which live should not henceforth live unto themselves, but unto him which died for them and rose again, verse 15. As Paul wrote elsewhere, we are to walk in newness of life, Romans chapter 6, verse 4. The challenge that Paul brings to us is that we're not to think of the life of Christ at the purely human level after the flesh, but in terms of its spiritual implications for our lives. And I wonder whether I do that. Perhaps you do.